I'm Mike Clancy, and this is part two of my seven-part lecture series on Project AZORIAN, the CIA's attempt to covertly recover a Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. In this video, we will talk about the Glomar 2 mission, final preparations for the recovery operation, and what did the Soviets know. So let's talk about the Glomar 2 mission. This is a picture of the Glomar 2, a global marine deep ocean drill ship. And in late 1970, the Glomar 2 was deployed to the K-129 wreck site to take higher quality pictures than were taken by the Halibut 2 years before. Also measure the slope of the ocean bottom where the submarine lay, and most importantly, take a core sample of the bottom. Now they use a gravity core, which is a typical instrument used in oceanographic research, and a gravity core looks something like this. You have a heavy weight here on top of a piston core, basically a hollow pipe with a piston in it. There's a coil of wire here and a locking mechanism. This is a trigger system, and when the core is lowered down and the trigger senses the bottom, the coil of wire is released and the heavy weight drives the piston tube down into the ocean bottom for several feet. And then when you pull it back up, the ocean core is retained in the piston and you're able to get a profile of what the bottom looks like to a depth of a few feet. Unfortunately, the gravity core was lost in this operation, depriving the engineers tasked with designing the capture vehicle of valuable information about the ocean floor the submarine was lying on. They needed to know how hard the bottom was, what was the material that the bottom was made out of, and that would inform their decision on how they would design the grabbers that were to grab under the submarine, get it in its grasp, and allow the submarine to be raised to the surface. Now, to obscure its interest in the K-129 wreck site, the Glomar 2 stopped at about a dozen other sites, pretending to be prospecting for manganese nodules that the Glomar Explorer would eventually harvest. And throughout this mission, the Glomar 2 was trailed by several Soviet intelligence gathering ships. The thing to remember about this is that the loss of this gravity core, the inability to get the core sample from below the submarine, plays a big role in what plays out in the rest of the mission. Now, in addition to that, the Glomar 2 also employed the remarkable camera gear and lighting system designed by my friend Joe Houston to take three-dimensional pictures, stereographic pictures of the submarine. And that allowed a very detailed three-dimensional model of the submarine to be made. And this is a picture of that model. It's about 3 to 4 feet long, currently on display at the CIA Museum in Langley, Virginia, not open to the public, but this picture is open to the public. This physical model was actually used in a simulator that the pilots of the capture vehicle used to practice bringing the capture vehicle down to grab a hold of the submarine, in very much the same way that a physical model was used to represent the lunar surface when the astronauts training for the Apollo missions practiced landing the lunar module on the surface, right about the same time of this operation. Final preparations for the recovery operation. Construction of the Glomar Explorer was completed in the spring of 1973. And in the summer of 1973, the Glomar underwent sea trials off the East Coast. And those shakedown crews finding many problems with the ship, correcting those problems. And finally, in late summer of 1973, the ship set out for its cruise around the tip of South America, up the coast of South America, ultimately to Long Beach, which was going to be the port that the Glomar would be deployed out of for the recovery operation. They encountered really difficult sea conditions. It was Southern Hemisphere winter as they were going around the tip of South America. An interesting thing happened in Chile. They put into port in Valparaiso, Chile from 12 to 13 September of 73. And just by chance, just as they pulled into port, the coup d'etat that displaced Salvador Allende and replaced him with Augusto Pinochet, beginning a 17-year military brutal dictatorship, was taking place. And the thing that makes that interesting is, of course, this was a CIA-owned ship with a number of CIA personnel aboard. And indeed, for several years prior to this coup d'etat, the CIA had been working to create conditions favorable for the coup. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger wanted to get rid of Allende. He was a left-leaning leader, democratically elected, who had sympathies towards the Soviet Union. They wanted him to be replaced. Augusto Pinochet was a right-wing general who was much more favorable to the administration's point of view. Now, there's no evidence that the CIA actually initiated this coup, but they did create conditions that undermined Allende and made this coup more likely. And certainly the ship and its crew encountered forces and officials sympathetic to Allende when they pulled into port. And fortunately, it wasn't discovered that, in fact, this was a CIA ship, and everything went okay. And they left Chile without any problem. Interesting story. When the ship pulled into Long Beach, the first thing that happened was the East Coast crew was fired, let go. That crew had no idea that this was a covert operation to raise the submarine. They thought they were working for Howard Hughes. They thought that they were going to have a career in deep sea mining. They probably had moved their families to California and suddenly they were all fired, go home. Well, that didn't sit too well with the Maritime Union. So the entire time the Glomar Explorer was hosted at Long Beach, they were picketed by the Maritime Union, which was of concern because a lot of material had to be moved through across those picket lines. A lot of classified material had to be moved across those picket lines as the Glomar was converted from a white ship to a black ship. A white ship is a ship that has no classified material, no classified gear on board. That was the configuration of the ship as it sailed around South America. Once it was in port in Long Beach, then many crates of gear and material, highly classified, was put on the ship and installed in preparation for the recovery operation. Speaking of crews, there were two crews that carried out the mission, A crew and B crew. Both were trained by the CIA at the Lockheed facility in Redwood City, California, on the San Francisco Bay. The A crew was responsible for the actual recovery operation. They're the ones who are actually going to grab the submarine and bring it to the surface. Once that happened, the ship was to head to Midway Island. A crew change there. The B crew would come on board, and the B crew was trained in dissecting and the submarine and exploiting the intelligence on board it. Both crews trained by the CIA. Now, here's a great picture of the HMB-1, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, with the recovery vehicle inside being towed under the Golden Gate Bridge in February of 74 on its way to rendezvous with the Glomar Explorer off Santa Catalina Island. By this time, the Glomar had completed its West Coast sea trials. Those West Coast sea trials consisted of many forays out of Long Beach offshore to practice sending the pipe string down to various depths, learning how to get it down, how to get it back up. They learned a lot of things about how the ship responded to seas. When they opened the well bay doors, they found that the seas were large, moderate sea conditions. The water would slosh back and forth in the moon pool, creating very dangerous conditions. In one case, they had trouble getting the well bay doors to close. They had to send down a couple of divers, retired Navy SEALs, and they were almost lost. It was that dangerous. So this whole operation actually was really pretty dangerous. In any case, those West Coast sea trials were completed in the fall of 73 off the coast of Southern California. And by February of 74, it was time to mate up the capture vehicle with the Glomar. And of course, the capture vehicle was always secured inside the HMB-1, mainly to shield it from view. If the Soviets had gotten one good look at the capture vehicle from a spy satellite, for example, they would know immediately that this cover story about deep ocean mining was indeed false. It was a cover story because they would have very quickly concluded that this thing inside this barge was not designed to mine manganese nodules from the seafloor, but rather it was designed to recover an underwater object like their submarine. So that was the main purpose of the HMB-1. And this is this is an artist's conception of what the whole operation would look like when the capture vehicle was transferred to the Glomar. Essentially, the HMB-1 would be submerged in shallow water. The roof would open up. The Glomar would maneuver over top of it, well bay doors open. The docking legs would come down, attach to each end of the capture vehicle, bring it up inside the Glomar, well bay doors close, water's drained out, and there's the capture vehicle inside the ship. Then the HMB-1 is surfaced and towed back to Redwood City. That's what it would look like from below. Here's what it actually looked like from above, because indeed on 27 February 74, the capture vehicle was transferred from HMB-1 to Glomar Explorer at Isthmus Cove off Santa Catalina Island in public view. There were many people there at the time. And you can see these sailboats here, people kind of cruising around, seeing what's going on. Lots of people observed this whole operation from shore, but they never got a look at the capture vehicle, of course. It was always either inside the HMB-1 or underwater. This is a picture of HMB-1 where it's been towed into place before it submerged. Here's a picture of it on the process of being submerged. And this picture, the HMB-1 is sitting on the bottom, like in that picture we looked at, and the Glomar is maneuvering over the top of it. You can see the disturbed water here. That's the side thrusters moving the Glomar sideways to position itself over the HMB-1 and to grab the capture vehicle with these docking legs, which would be sent down, grabbing hold of it and bringing them up. So once that happened, once the capture vehicle was mated up with the Glomar Explorer, the West Coast sea trials continued, and now they were not just lowering the pipe string, they were actually lowering the capture vehicle at various depths on a weekly basis, practicing that and practicing docking and undocking. The docking and undocking maneuver was very difficult. What I mean there is when the capture vehicle was secured to these docking legs, it would move with the ship and everything was fine. But there was a period of time where the docking legs would have to splay out, and suddenly the weight of the capture vehicle would be fully suspended from the pipe string via this derrick right here. When that happened, if there was any kind of sea out there, the ship would be rocking and rolling, and the capture vehicle would swing back and forth below it, and oftentimes crashing into each end of the capture vehicle, crashing into the docking legs with tremendous force. And that was a difficult period of a few minutes when that was happening. So here's some video clips from the West Coast Sea Trials, and I'll provide a little bit of narration as going along, give you a sense of what it was like on board the ship. A lot of what was on board the ship had to do with moving the pipes around. There's tons of gear and material and mechanisms on the ship, on the deck of the ship. And most of that had to do with getting the pipes out of the hold and pipe handling system and bringing them up like this, flipping them up vertically in the derrick here. And then that's how, they would be attached together and would lower the capture vehicle down. Here's actual footage of two pipes. They would join them together into 60-foot lengths. Here's gear on board the ship that moves these, typically about 7 tons to 14 tons if two are put together. Individual pipes were about 7 tons. You can see a man here. 4,000 pounds, 4,000 foot-pounds of torque to screw them together. More mechanism to move the pipes around the deck, get them in place. Heave compensation and gimbal systems were extremely important. This looks like there's something going up and down on the deck of the ship, but in fact, it's the ship itself that's going up and down. And this is the heave compensation system. It's actually staying in place. It's the ship that's going up and down. And that's to keep the pipe string from heaving up and down. I'll talk about that later. It's really important. This looks like something rocking back and forth on the deck of the ship, but in fact, it's staying fixed in place, and it's the ship that's rocking back and forth. This is the gimbal system that would keep the pipe string vertical. Here's a great picture of the capture vehicle in the moon pool. These you'll recognize are the tops of the breakout legs here. This is called the strong back here, and this is the top of the pipe string grabbing hold of it. Here's what it would look like in concept. The well bay door is open, the capture vehicle is lowered below, and it's on its way down to the bottom, over 3 miles, 16,500 feet down to grab a hold of the submarine. This is what it looked like from below. Capture vehicle coming down through the well bay doors and going to the bottom to grab the submarine. This is video from inside the heavy lift control room. Lots of video cameras on the capture vehicle, lots of stress sensors and all kinds of telemetry coming back from the capture vehicle, allowing them to hook up with the submarine. So now's a good time to ask, what did the Soviets know about all of this? This is extremely unusual technology. It was widely publicized in all the trade journals all around the world. That must have grabbed the Soviets' attention. What did they know about this? Did they suspect anything? Well, the Soviets had ample clues about the U.S. plans to recover the K-129, but they failed to connect the dots. And there were plenty of dots to connect. For example, An anonymous note was passed to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. on 22 October 1970, stating, in reference to the Glomar 2 mission, quote, in March of 1968, a Soviet submarine sank in the Pacific. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency is using the minesweeping vessel Glomar to hunt for the submarine. She departed Honolulu 17 October and will be at the point latitude 40 degrees north, longitude 180 degrees east in early November. A well-wisher, unquote. Well, obviously this was someone that had some knowledge of the project, somewhere on the periphery of the project. They got a lot right here. They got the March 68 sinking of the submarine right. They got the point, the nominal location right, 40 north, 180 east. The Glomar 2 was not a minesweeping vessel. But in any case, they got a lot right here. And this note was passed to the Soviets in their mission. They ignored it. They didn't believe it. They just didn't pay attention. The Glomar 2 mission, which they observed spending a considerable amount of time near 40 north, 180 east, again, they failed to connect that dot. Now, this is a bit sketchy here. I've read of a possible leak of Project Azorian information to a Soviet intelligence operative in 73. That's not solid. That may or may not have happened, but I'll throw it out there anyway. The incredibly unique nature of the Glomar Explorer. I mean, it's fair to say the Glomar Explorer was the most unique ship ever built, and that's probably still true. And the technology on board for its time was truly amazing, and that certainly must have drawn their attention. And finally, technical and financial questions about the plausibility of the seafloor mining cover story. And I'll tell you an anecdote here, kind of where the story first touched my life. In the spring of 73, right about the time the Glomar Explorer had been beginning its East Coast sea trials, I had a class at Florida Institute of Technology in marine chemistry. I was a senior in college majoring in oceanography. And I have a very distinct memory of the professor talking about this project and the Howard Hughes initiative to do the seafloor mining. He got up in front of the class, did a very simple sort of back of the envelope calculation on the blackboard, and pretty quickly came to the conclusion this doesn't make sense. It's going to cost 10 times more to recover and process these manganese nodules, now known as polymetallic nodules, to retrieve their metals than the metals are going to be worth. It just doesn't make financial sense. And the numbers he put up, were pretty solid. Now, the Soviets could have done that calculation. Anyone could have done that calculation and come to the conclusion this doesn't make sense. But I think what made it work is the fact that Howard Hughes' name was involved. And people would do this calculation and conclude, how is he going to make money? This doesn't make sense. And then come to the conclusion of, well, Howard Hughes, that guy, damn, he probably knows something we don't know. That's probably what saved the cover story. But the fact of the matter is, it was pretty easy to show that the seafloor mining proposition, at least back then, was doomed to failure. It isn't necessarily true today. In fact, seafloor mining is a big issue right now. It's certainly going forward. A lot of it has to do with the fact that technology is better, cheaper to recover these modules, cheaper to process them, but also they contain metals that are much more valuable now, rare earth metals, for example, that are highly valuable. So the Soviets had ample clues about the U.S. plans to recover the K-129, but they failed to connect the dots, except for one guy. And that guy was Rear Admiral Anatoly Styrov. He was the Soviet Deputy Chief of Naval Intelligence for the Pacific at the time. Rear Admiral Styrov fully believed that the Glomar Explorer mission in the summer of 74 was indeed to raise the K-129. However, he was unable to convince his superiors in the Soviet naval hierarchy. And as a result, he was allowed only very marginal naval resources and assets to pursue his suspicion of the Glomar Explorer. Now, this is not Admiral Styrov. This is Admiral Gorshkov. Admiral Gorshkov was the senior admiral in the Soviet Navy from 56 to 85. And he's the guy who had to be convinced. But there was a whole lot of chain of command between Admiral Styrov and Admiral Gorshkov. And Styrov was just simply not able to convince the naval hierarchy that this was happening. Interesting footnote here. The Walker spy ring, which you've probably read about, consisting of John Walker, his friend Jerry Whitworth, his older brother Arthur Walker, and his son Michael Walker, operated from 67 to 85. All of these gentlemen were at various times in the Navy, either as enlisted, or Jerry Whitworth was lieutenant commander. John Walker and Arthur Walker were chiefs, chief petty officers, and Michael Walker was an enlisted sailor. It operated from 67 to 85, and they provided cryptographic material to the Soviets for money, allowed them, by most accounts, to decipher more than 1 million encrypted US naval messages at the secret level, perhaps some at the top secret level. But there is no evidence that any of these messages compromised Project Azorian. And all it would have taken would have been one. If the Soviets had intercepted and decrypted one message that tied the U.S. Navy to the Glomar Explorer, that would have been game over. But that didn't happen. I want to talk a little bit about classification. The fact that didn't happen is testimony to the fact how highly classified and compartmented Project Azorian was. When I say compartmented, realize that this was a top secret SCI project, which the SCI stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information. So there was a compartment. Think of it being like a folder on your computer where everything pertaining to this whole operation would be classified. And the name of that compartment was Jennifer. You may have heard the Jennifer Project associated with this. Well, it's actually Project Azorian, but Project Azorian, as well as the follow-on project to raise the submarine, were contained within the Jennifer compartment. So Jennifer was a code name. You had to be cleared for Jennifer intelligence to get access to Project Azorian material. In some of the books, they talk about the Jennifer document control system. In fact, it was the compartment associated with this top secret SCI project. That concludes part 2 of my 7-part series. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.